Welcome. Namaste. Thank you for being here. Thank you for making the time and the space in your life for this session, this practice, this conversation. I'm grateful for your presence. I must say that every time I organize a workshop, it encourages me to read, to learn, to reflect. So I feel like I benefit a lot from having the opportunity to offer sessions on different topics such as this, living with an open heart. So we'll begin in a comfortable seated position, taking this moment to lengthen the spine. You can close your eyes or keep a soft gaze towards the ground, whatever feels best for you today. Take a deep breath in through your nose and release the breath through your mouth. Allow your body to relax. Allow your mind to arrive in the here and now. Relax your face. Soften your shoulders. Relax your abdomen. Soften through your hips, your legs, all the way down into your feet and out through your arms, all the way to your fingertips. Take a deep inhale. And a slow exhale. And now bring your awareness into your heart space. Allow your awareness to rest in the middle of your chest. Whatever you perceive in this moment, let it be as it is. Not trying to change anything. Nothing to do. Nothing to be. Just this moment as it is. Just you as you are. And together we take another deep breath in. And slowly we release the breath. And keeping the awareness on your heart space, begin to move your body in any way that feels intuitive. Perhaps a head roll or a stretch, or anything else that your body is longing for. And in your own time, begin to open your eyes to join the space, join the circle. I know it looks more like a rectangle, but I like to imagine that, visualize that we're sitting in a circle. So welcome again, and thank you for being here. I will start by sharing a little bit about the inspiration for this workshop, and then I'll speak about the intention, and we'll go into the tools and the practices to live with an open heart. So first of all, the inspiration for this workshop, I was offering a retreat not so long ago, and welcome, Christy. And at the end of the retreat, one of the participants asked me if I was interested in doing a one-to-one session with her where we could speak about how to sustain living with an open heart, because she shared that she saw that I was very much crying with participants when they were sharing their stories, but then afterwards she saw me giggling and laughing. So I think she was a bit perplexed by the fact that I could feel so deeply, and then on the other side just be like, okay, well, life goes on. and I thought that was a compliment, actually, to be able to feel deeply, but then to be able to put aside. So we're not forgetting, we're simply saying, okay, this can be left here now, and I will go on with life. And actually, when she asked me, I thought, well, it hasn't always been this way for me. It hasn't always been, and it still isn't always easy to live joyfully when in the back of my mind, I know that there is something tragic happening somewhere in the world, for example, which is actually happening all the time. But there have been tools and there have been practices that have helped me to be able to find balance, to be able to find some solace in the fact that it's okay to continue to live. And it's not only okay, it's important, it's vital to find joy, to connect with the essence of happiness, of bliss. Meanwhile, all of this happening. So when she asked me if we could do the one-to-one session, I said, yes, sure. I listened to some podcasts, I read some books I had already read, and we had an hour together, and it felt like a marathon. And within an hour, I just tried to compress the whole session. And at the end of it, I thought, this is not something for an hour, this is for a workshop. So I thought, I wonder if people would be interested, and you guys are here. So the answer is yes, there are more of us thinking, how can we find this balance of feeling compassion, of caring for others, and also living life fully? So I'm glad that there are others like me who find this an interesting topic, and that we can come together in community and look at these big questions, because I think they are big questions, important questions. And having said this, everything I will be sharing, of course, is from my own experience, from what I've learned, what I've heard, what I've witnessed. But if anything doesn't resonate with you, you can discard it. And if you have a different point of view at any time, please know that you can unmute yourself and share. I think there's a lot of richness when we come together and we share our different life experiences and we learn from each other. So I will be speaking, sharing, but I'll also allow some time for participation if you feel inspired to. So having said all of that, going back to, let's say, the beginning of my journey, and I'm sharing a little bit about my journey, and I'll be reading also from some different authors who have really inspired me on this journey of living with an open heart and opening the heart again, because often what happens when we feel pain is that the heart wants to close. But I read a quote recently that said, it's not always easy to live with an open heart, but it's harder to keep the heart closed. So actually, yes, it might feel challenging at times, like, oh, but again, I feel like I just want to protect myself. And again, opening the heart and, oh, okay, can I really be with all of this? And with practice, there's a softening in the heart space. So that's what we'll be talking about today. How can we continue to open the heart, continuously opening the heart? So I'll share, because when I started thinking about this, I went back a long time ago when I was only a little girl. And I grew up in Mexico, and in Mexico, there's a lot of poverty. And my dad had given me 50 pesos, which is quite a lot of money for a small child. And I was so happy that I had my 50 pesos and we were going to go to my dad's friend's shop. He had like a jewelry shop and we were going there. And I saw on the ground this woman with a baby, carrying a baby. And she was clearly asking for money. And my heart broke. I was only a little girl, but actually children have that capacity of natural compassion. It's actually a very natural thing to feel as human beings, to recognize the other as our family, as someone who deserves the same love and care as we do. So in that moment, naturally, I gave her my 50 pesos. And then I didn't have my 50 pesos, but I thought, I have given it to someone and that feels right, a woman with a baby. And my dad actually was encouraging. He said that was a good thing to do. But then just further down the road, there was an old man, an old crippled man. And then I thought, but now I don't have 50 pesos. And now this other person also needs money. And in that moment, I think it was maybe the first time that my heart broke and I felt a sense of helplessness. Like, well, I just helped that person, but now there's another person suffering. And what can I do? Of course, as a child, I didn't have a bank account or access to more money. And having said that, money isn't always the only help we can give. A smile and simple presence can be a really powerful act, or even not an act of presence, we could say. So in that moment, I felt like, oh, they're suffering, and there's suffering I can't do anything about. And then fast forward many years on, I remember this was living in London. There was an Oxfam advert, and there were children, hungry children on the advert. And of course, they pick images that are very poignant. So I saw the images and I started crying. And my boyfriend at the time said to me, Melissa, you can't cry every time you see something really sad. And I actually thought, no, you can't not cry seeing something so tragic. Actually, why am I in the wrong for feeling so deeply the fact that other people, other human beings are suffering? And I thought, why shouldn't this be turned around? Why am I wrong for feeling sad that I'm seeing people suffering? So in that moment, I thought, interesting that society tells us, no, you can't feel too much because that will be a problem. And I thought, well, perhaps we don't feel enough. Perhaps that is the problem. But I also realized once I started doing this kind of work of organizing retreats and doing one-to-one work, that if I took all the suffering I was exposed to and kept it, then I wouldn't be able to do this for very long, because actually it also feels like a weight. So if we take the suffering as if it were our own suffering and we keep it and we kind of like safeguard it, then at the end of the day, it can feel really actually disheartening and actually heavy. And so then I thought, well, this isn't also, not feeling. I don't think that is the solution. I think it's a superpower to be able to feel, but feeling and keeping and holding on to the suffering is not sustainable. So how do we do this? And by the way, I haven't figured it out, because I'm still finding myself at times, feeling pulled into a state of sorrow and feeling grief. And then I remember, oh yes, there's also this is also true. So I'm learning and I'm sharing my learnings with you, and I hope they will be useful. But I have by no means figured it out, figured life out. So here we are, learning together. And so that's a bit about my journey. And I wanted to open the session with a brief reading. So I'll be reading quite a bit from this book. Welcome to those who just joined us. So Welcoming the Unwelcome by Pema Chodron. She's a Buddhist monk. And she says, bodhicitta, the awakened heart, begins with the wish to be free from whatever gets in the way of our helping others. We long to be free from the confused thoughts and habitual patterns that cover up our basic goodness, so that we can be less reactive, less fearful, and less stuck in our old ways. So the aspiration of the session today is bodhicitta, this awakened heart, this awakened mind. So by reflecting, by sharing the tools I'll be sharing, it's really an opportunity for us to reflect on how can we lessen the suffering, not only in the world, but in our community, in our family, in our relationships, in ourselves? Because it's all well and good to say there's so much suffering far, far away, but how much suffering is there in our direct environment? And what can we do to lessen that suffering? How can we transmute the grief that we might feel, the suffering we might perceive, into inspiration to live with this open heart? And I want to ask you now, actually, I want to invite you to journal to you what living with an open heart means, what living with an open heart feels like. And we'll just take a couple of minutes. So as you write about this, and if you don't feel like writing, you can simply close your eyes and reflect. So what does it feel like to live with an open heart? What does it mean to live with an open heart? And you might find yourself reflecting on a situation recently where you felt your heart fully open. And as you do this, see if you can drop your awareness into the heart space. So just as we did at the beginning of the session, bringing the awareness to the heart, see if you can write with full awareness on the heart space. So how does it feel to live with an open heart? What does it mean? What does it look like? And if this question feels challenging, practicing compassion for yourself, and you can finish your sentence now and take a moment to look at what you've written and highlight the keywords. So what words stand out from what you've, or we could write a book each on living with an open heart. So it's just a few sentences to reflect. But what keywords stand out to you about living with an open heart? And once you've highlighted those keywords, if you feel inspired to, you can share in the chat the words that stand out. When we think of living with an open heart, what words come to mind, come to heart? Presence. Gratitude. And don't worry if someone's already said the word you were going to say, we can have repeats. Living and expressing truth. Feeling all emotions. Love. Gentle. Enjoying the moment. Compassion. Seeing the good in others and oneself. Beautiful. These are so simple, yet when we read them, right? Living and expressing our truth, living with presence, living with gratitude in a gentle way, enjoying the moment, living with compassion. These are all things that we can aspire to, and clearly we are all familiar with them because we've shared them. And yet, sometimes, if we're here, most probably we have felt that closing of the heart. So although we know we are familiar with what living with an open heart feels like, and all these words are things I want to experience for myself, thank you very much. But then sometimes there's this closeness of the heart. So now I want to ask you, what are the challenges of living with an open heart? So again, you can take a couple of minutes to journal on what challenges you have experienced personally. And we'll then look at whether that is really the challenge of living with the open heart or our perceived experience. See if you can keep the awareness in the heart. Being hurt, experiencing burnout. And you're welcome to share any keywords that arise for you in this reflection. Fear, disappointment. So being hurt, experiencing burnout, not knowing how to listen, disappointment, fear. So all these are also things that we might experience, perhaps not because our heart is open, but perhaps because we don't know how to keep our heart open. So when there is more fear than love, we could say this is a closing of the heart. So by recognizing how, when the heart closes, feels like, what it feels like, then it can give us an idea of when our heart is closing. And then we also have giving too much of oneself. So these are just some of the possible outcomes of not knowing how to maintain the heart open in a sustainable way, in a way that feels good to us as well as to others. So how do we transform this? How do we sustain this open heart, and how do we transform things that come, for example, fear or disappointment, into an even more open heart? And it's interesting because often we think that to protect the heart so that the heart doesn't get hurt, we actually want to close it. But actually, living life with an open heart is living life open to life. And when we speak of an open heart, we're also speaking of an open mind. And a few years when I went to a festival in Panama, it was a gathering of elders, and there was a South African elder, and he said to me, well, not just to me, to a group of us, he said, live with your hands open. And I thought, okay, that's a relatively simple cue, live with your hands open. And I was reflecting as I was planning this talk of how much our open heart is also reflected in our hands. He was saying, with open hands, you give and you receive without ever clinging. So when we start to close our heart, we might notice this beginning to close of the mind, closing of the hands. And we can very simply choose, oh yeah, open hands, open heart, open mind. And when we are open, when our heart is open, it means life can happen as it's unfolding. So we're not trying to control. And I say this to you, and I had a moment, I had to laugh at myself earlier on because I'm planning this workshop about living with an open heart. And then I was like, oh no, I didn't invite so-and-so. I should send this. I wonder, if people will come. And then I was thinking, hang on a second, I'm planning this workshop about living with an open heart. And here I am worrying about the outcome. And really living with an open heart it doesn't mean non-action. We're going to speak about that later on in the session. It means action. Of course, I organize the event, I invite people, and then I trust. I'm not trying to control and manipulate and make things go in the direction that I want. It doesn't mean that we cannot take inspired action. So sometimes our broken heart gives us the fuel to take action. In certain cases, action is necessary. But when we're trying to control life, we're not living with an open heart. We're living with a controlling heart that's trying to steer the things in the direction in our favor, or so we think, because ultimately we don't really know what's in our favor. We often think we know, but we don't know so much. So opening our heart to life is saying, I'm here. Okay, I surrender whatever you bring to me. I will open it up to it with gratitude, receive it with a welcome attitude, and then see what comes from that. So the very first step, which is, I think, the hardest one, but I thought we should start with the hardest one, and then we'll break them down and maybe go back to this one. But the very first step is acceptance. Acceptance is a beautiful word. And in reality, when things are not going the way we want them to go, whatever it is, acceptance can be really difficult, actually. Acceptance is, in theory, wonderful, but when we're faced with it, it can feel like we just want to resist. And actually, when there is resistance, that means the mind is coming into play. As I continue to speak, see if you can continue to keep your awareness in the heart and notice how that changes your perception. So are you listening with your mind, or are you listening with your heart? And when I speak of acceptance, maybe the mind will say, but some things cannot be accepted. And I highly recommend reading The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, and I'll be reading some snippets from that book. But what he explains is that often the suffering is caused by our resistance to the situation rather than the situation itself. Things are as they are. So he says, your first chance is to surrender each moment to the reality of that moment, knowing that what is cannot be undone because it already is. You say yes to what is or accept what isn't. Then you do what you have to do, whatever the situation requires. If you abide in this state of acceptance, you create no more negativity, no more suffering, no more unhappiness. You live in a state of non-resistance, a state of grace and lightness, free of struggle. I think we all can agree we'd love to live in a state of grace and lightness, free of struggle, right? I mean, that sounds great to me. However, when the situation arises, when I'll go with something silly just to keep it, but you get to your favorite restaurant looking forward to eat something, and you arrive and they say that, you know, they don't have that thing. Staying in a state of grace and lightness in the moment, there might still be a bit of resistance, but I wanted things to be different. And I'm using the example of the restaurant because it's a gentle one. But when perhaps someone we love is told that they have a terminal illness, can we stay in a state of acceptance? Because the resistance is not going to change the situation. The resistance is not going to make the disease go away. The resistance is simply going to add to the suffering. And this is quite simple to understand, but yet in practice, how do we practice this acceptance? And presence is the answer. So that is the first thing that, Christy, you said when I asked, what does living with an open heart feel like, is like presence. Of course, presence. Presence is when the mind pauses for a moment. So there's no more story of, yes, but this is not fair, or yes, but it shouldn't be this way, or yes, but. It's actually, okay, yes, this is the situation in this moment. And this can go for the situation in the restaurant, or it can go for a loved one being sick, or it can go for any other situation. But the state of acceptance, the state of surrender, which in a way could be said to be one of the hardest things to do when things feel unacceptable, but that is the best way to receive whatever life gives us. And from this space of acceptance, we can take powerful action. When there is resistance, the action is going to be chaotic, full of resentment, full of frustration, and then it's not a powerful action. It's actually just reactivity, and I think it's unfair and it shouldn't be this way. And often the result will not be very efficient. If we can first sit with that, accept, and then take action, things will be very different. So he's saying, do not resist the pain, allow it to be there, surrender to the grief, the despair, the fear, the loneliness, or whatever form suffering takes. Witness it without labeling it mentally. Embrace it. When there is no way out, there is still a way through. So don't turn away from the pain. Face it, feel it fully, feel it. Don't think about it. Give all your attention to the feeling. Give your complete attention to what you feel and refrain from mentally labeling it. So this is the second step, we could say, of acceptance. And it might feel at first like we're resisting it, but once we've spoken about this, then we can recognize resistance in ourselves, resistance in our body. You might even be listening to this and feel some resistance to what you're hearing. See if you can bring your awareness back in the heart. I'll be saying this many times so we can get used to this feeling of having the awareness in the heart. When our awareness is in the heart, we become present. And if having the awareness in the heart feels challenging, bring your awareness to your breath. Let's take a breath together. And so this simple act of taking a deep breath in a situation where we're feeling resistance can help us to recognize it, because resistance will manifest in different forms for all of us, but resistance is ultimately tension, is saying no to the present moment. It doesn't mean we have to like the present moment. This is something I struggled myself on my journey. I was like, but sometimes I don't like the present moment. How am I supposed to just pretend I like it? Is that what presence is? Not at all. It's actually saying, I don't like the present moment, and I accept that I don't like it. That's the difference. I'm grieving right now, but instead of not wanting to grieve and doing anything to distract myself, some of us will go to series or food or social media or whatever we tend to go for so we cannot feel. That is just prolonging the suffering. So please don't whip yourself if you recognize any of these behaviors and think, yes, that's me too. What a terrible person I am. No, these are natural tendencies that we develop as a means to protect ourselves. Unfortunately, the protection is only prolonging the pain, because if we can meet the pain, feel it all, feel it fully, as Luba was saying, living with an open heart is feeling all the emotions, everything, all of it, the pain, the joy, then we can go through it, feel it all intensely. And then on the other side, because when we keep our heart closed, we're not only protecting ourselves from the pain, we're actually protecting ourselves, preventing ourselves from feeling everything. So we don't only not feel the pain, or we think we don't, because actually this contraction is not a pleasant living experience. It feels limited and like this, but we think, at least I'm not feeling too much hurt, but we're also not feeling the joy. We're not feeling the bliss. And those are natural human experiences. Bliss is our nature. Sat Chit Ananda. This is what the yogic scriptures tell us, that our natural way of being is existence, consciousness, bliss. And what is taking away from that? The mind. So all the suffering that we see in the world is caused by the mind, by this egoic structure that tells us that we are separate, that it wants to survive, that it needs to be above others or even below, but separate. And so when we can recognize that in ourselves, we can stop ourselves in the process. When we notice this tendency of mine, of more, me first, and we can see it, and then we can say, oh, how interesting. It's manifesting now. Oh, contraction of the heart, awareness back in the heart. Do I really want to live from the mind, from this place of contraction, or do I want to live, as the South African elder said, with open hands? And then things come to me, they pass through me, and they go on. And that is, if we have experienced it, such a beautiful way to live life. And it's actually easier than living with a closed heart, but It takes practice. So the second step after acceptance, which obviously is a practice, it's not like you decide, I accepted, that's it. Oh, great, workshop done. Go and accept everyone. If it was that easy, there'd be no workshop. We wouldn't be sitting here. I wouldn't have listened to, I don't know how many podcasts and read all these books that I have around me, you know, welcoming the unwelcome, start where you are, the power of now. It's all pointing to the same thing. Accept what is because it is. And so if that is a really difficult emotion, if that is grief, if that is loneliness, if that is doubt, accept it. Accept it. And so that's the second part of acceptance, is feeling, being willing to feel it all without holding back. But at first it might feel like too much. So we might want to dance around the edges of the feeling, like, okay, maybe I haven't visited this feeling, but I'm going to allow it. And I'll share with you actually quite intimately, but for many years, I didn't want to have psychotherapy because in my family, there is some history of suicide. And so in my mind, depression and sadness were things to be avoided at all costs, because the worst that could happen is someone can take their life. It happened on my father's side, on my mother's side. And so I had a lot of fear of so-called negative emotions. So I thought, you know, you just got to be happy and keep on, keep going. Unfortunately, that prevents also to connect on a deeper level. So my relationships were sort of not, I wouldn't say completely superficial, but I wouldn't really go deep because I was trying to stay afloat, you know, above the water. Don't go and look too deep. And I started having therapy sessions, which was very helpful. And you know, the first session I just said to her, you know, everything's great and my childhood was great, so everything's great. And she was like, great, okay, let's talk. And you know, 6 months down the line, I had a complete breakdown. It was actually when I arrived in Guatemala, and I cried. It was like a full moon, and I was alone, and I was just crying, and I didn't have any friends here. And when I lived in Panama, I knew everyone. So I felt like, you know, no one should see me feeling all the feels because I have to be what I thought I had to be, not human, right? And then in that moment of crying so much and really feeling the grief of the little me who had grief, and all of us have at some point. And the next day I walked out and I felt a lightness and a joy. And I was just walking in Antigua, you know, in the city where I didn't know anyone. And I went to it, and I felt like all the tears had actually, you know, like a good cry. Like I felt like my step was lighter, and I was feeling joyful. And that was such an insightful moment, because I thought, wait a second. So you can feel really sad and really happy the next day? Well, that's great news, because that means that I was so scared of going there, because I thought, then what if you get stuck there? Because I knew of people with depression, but depression is a different condition, is revisiting the same story. It has also to do with brain chemistry. So sometimes we may need medical help, of course, to deal with this, but often when we are reliving pain, it's because we inflict it on ourselves. So one thing is to feel it all, rather than saying, you know, no, I don't want to feel like I was doing for so many years. Actually, no. So I was willing to feel other people's pain, but not my own, when in fact, it's not my own or theirs. It's just pain. It's everyone's pain. It's the pain. It's not mine. It's not yours. It's the pain. So once I got familiar with that and was able to feel it, I realized that I could transmute a difficult energy into, However, what is really important here is to notice, what are our patterns? So this is let's say the next step in a way. It's so self-awareness can help us to not fall into, if I consider myself to be an empath, then perhaps I always go into sadness. So what emotions are regular visitors? What emotions? So it might be anger for someone, might be frustration, might be loneliness. Is it really present in this moment because of my current situation? Or is it something I'm reliving? And in asking this question, we may reflect on the fact that the news often get us to connect with the same feeling. So the news is trying to get your attention and to feel a certain way. Often fear is the result of a high news consumption. This is not to say that we do not care. This is not to say that we do not take action when we can take action. But are we living every day of our lives in a state of fear, in a state of sorrow, and in a state of grief? Because if that is the case, how much of that is contributing to world peace, if that's what we long for? Is it really helpful? Is it really contributing? Because if I'm in a state of grief and sorrow and anger all the time, in my current environment, there aren't any major problems, but that is the energy I'm emitting. So my neighbors, when they greet me, will just feel, from me, an emanation of this energy. And they will then transfer that to others, because there's something that is called emotional resonance. And so we connect to what other people are feeling. So by practicing self-awareness, we can then say, hang on a second, is this emotion from now, from this moment? We're not rejecting it, but we're inquiring. Or is this something I'm just dragging on with me, that I'm just taking with me everywhere? Like I'm the empath, so I spend my life, sad. And then when we ask this question, then sometimes we might just start laughing at ourselves, because actually in this very moment, that is not something that is happening right now. It's just me reliving it. And we might just find a lightness in that. And wait a second. Oh yeah, I'm just repeating this pattern, this mental pattern. So self-awareness means that we can bring your awareness back to your heart, come back to ourselves rather than be in the world. So we're not in the world, but we're first in our heart. And then we're in the world in our heart, or in our heart in the world, as opposed to being completely caught up in the world. And I can guarantee that every day of your life, you could find something to be sad about. There will always be suffering. Actually, this was one of the points from the very first point, is that suffering is a part of human existence, not only human existence, of sentient existence. And this is something that led the Buddha to his illumination, to his enlightenment. Actually, today is a Buddhist celebration. I didn't know, and it's not always the 4th of November, but it's the celebration of the return of the Buddha from the heavens to the earth. So we're speaking of the Buddha on this auspicious day by pure coincidence or serendipity. But if you know a little bit about the Buddha's story, he was a prince. And when he was born, his father invited these, we can call them magicians, these men, to foretell his future. And they said that he had the potential of being an enlightened one. And his father thought, no, because that means he'll be a renunciate. He won't want to be my son anymore. And they said that he would become enlightened by seeing a dying person, a sick person, and an old person. And so his father said, okay, sorted. We'll just keep him living within the container of this castle, this great temple, and he will not see anyone who was sick, dying, or elderly. So his entire childhood, until he was a young man, Gautama Buddha, had never seen anyone who was sick or dying. And so he didn't know about that. And when he discovered, so when he left the palace and when he discovered, and it is said, the story says, that when he left the palace, he saw a dying person, he saw a sick person, and he saw an elderly person, and he was disenchanted from his perception of life. And he started questioning, well, is human life then just mostly suffering? Because actually birth is traumatic for most. And then, sickness happens to children from a young age. And then at some point there is separation. The parents will become elderly and they will die. And we will also become elderly. And so when you look at human life, you say, well, there's quite some suffering. It doesn't mean all is suffering. It doesn't mean that there isn't also joy. But if we don't accept suffering, then we don't accept life. because suffering is a part of life. So as part of our acceptance is also saying, okay, as part of life, there will be some suffering. The process of enlightenment is the liberation from the suffering. So what enlightened beings have told us, what they have taught us over the ages, is that when you stop identifying with your mind, when you stop identifying with your body, this is the cessation of suffering. How much of our suffering is self-inflicted? And you might think, well, actually, I don't think I suffer much. But if you reflect to maybe yesterday or this morning, or, there was some moment where you might have found yourself frowning or worrying about the future, worrying about the past, worrying about what's happening at the other side of the world, worried about your finances, worried about your aging parents or your growing children, or worrying about something. And what these enlightened beings tell us is that it's all mental formations. We're resisting life all the time, and therefore we're suffering. If we go back to self-awareness, if we can cultivate enough presence, then we can interrupt the story. It is said that 99% of the things we worry about will never happen. What a waste of energy. When I found that out, I was like, oh, I'm just going to stop worrying. And then I was like, oh no, now I'm worried, I'm going to worry. So we tend to find things, right? It's like, oh, what could I possibly worry about? And in a moment, sometimes like in this very moment, actually bring your awareness back to your heart. In this moment, in your world, all is okay. This is not to say in the entire world it's okay for everyone. But there was a time when it wasn't okay for you, when perhaps it was okay for them. And if you were on the other side of the world suffering, would you want others to be suffering with you? Or would you wish that there were at least some people living joyfully? And this is a question we can ask, right? There isn't an answer or a right answer. But if we can at least minimize the suffering that we inflict on ourselves and that we inflict on the world around us, well, at least we're contributing to a less suffering world. So rather than focusing all our energy on the suffering that is happening, because it is happening, we can focus our energy back here, presence. And if I can be in this state of loving awareness, then I'm contributing actively to a more loving world, to a more present world. And I mean, I sure want that. So now every time I catch myself in this hamster worry wheel, I'm like, oh, wait, I'm just going to get off the wheel for a moment and just pause and feel my breath and feel my heart. And okay, yes. And still, the ice caps will melt and probably are melting in this moment. But me worrying about it doesn't make me take action. Me thinking about it and saying, okay, what can I do at a punctual moment in time can be helpful. Overthinking about everything that could go wrong or that is going wrong from our little human perception, because we think we know, we think we see the big picture, but we only see from our point of view. We're going to get to that. But in reality, we don't really know what is good and what is bad. We just label from our limited perspective. So self-awareness, and as part of feeling it all, I want to share a method with you that is, it's called, the way they write it is LESR. So I'm just going to read from here. So the man who invented this is a human rights worker, Richard Rioch. And LESR stands for locate, embrace, stop, remain. Locate, embrace, stop, remain. And so locate is first investigate where the grasping, contracted sensation dwells in your body and make contact with it. So like I was saying, often if there's a feeling of tension, of, if there's resistance, it will also manifest in the body, because mind and body are not as separate as we perceive them to be. When there's tension in the mind, then there's tension in the body. When there's dis-ease in the mind, it translates as dis-ease in the body. So first we want to investigate. And you might notice, it might be for you that you start to hunch your shoulders. Or for me, it was one, I used to get irritated when the yoga teacher, when I started practicing yoga, would say, relax. And I'd be like, I'm relaxed, clearly not relaxed, but, but I was frustrated that they were telling me to relax when I was relaxed. And then I was able to see how much more relaxation could happen, but I was resisting it. And I noticed it was in my jaw. So when I wasn't relaxing, I was just like tensing my jaw. So right now you can scan your body, without changing anything, but just notice, is there any grasping, any holding anywhere in the body? If you find any, don't judge yourself for it. Just, oh yeah, maybe I can bring the awareness back to the heart and relax a little bit more. Maybe not, but maybe yes. So first we want to locate it. So investigate it. Where is it? What does it look like? We can call this emotional granularity. So really getting in contact with, what is it? Where is it? Sometimes giving it a color, a shape, or a place in the body can help us to connect with it deeper. Like, where is it in the body? If I'm feeling nervous, or if I'm feeling stressed, or if I'm feeling worried, do I feel it in my shoulders? Do I feel it in my brow? Do I feel it in my belly? What does it feel like? If it had a texture, if it had a color, if it had a size, what would it be like? So this is really helpful, not to dissociate from our emotions, but to gain some insight. So we stop being the emotion. If I do no investigation whatsoever, that's it. I'm sadness. I'm sadness. And we will say, right, I'm sad. It's not that we are sad, it's that we feel sad. If I say I'm sad, then I'm kind of stuck with sad. Whereas if I say I feel sad, I'm feeling, and feeling is transient. So, now I feel happy, actually. Now I feel slightly different to I am. And so with this investigation, we can really get into contact with, actually, it's not a name, it's not a word. We can also use the Atlas of Emotions, which can be helpful, which is naming the emotions. But before we go into that, even just exploring the emotion, and sometimes by the time you've really zoomed into it, it's kind of dissipated. I remember when I used to live in London, sometimes I would drink coffee and I would get this agitation, and I would feel all of a sudden anxious, and I would be overwhelmed by the anxiety, and it could almost stop me from working. I would sit in front of my computer and just be overwhelmed by this feeling of I'm just anxious. And I never looked into what it was. I didn't know it was because I drank so much coffee. I discovered it when I stopped drinking coffee. I was like, oh my God, I'm not anxious anymore. So, I still, of course, experience anxiety every now and then, but it's very different now, because now there's a curiosity rather than a labeling oh no, again, I'm anxious, and how long will this be here for? Rather, oh, interesting. Oh, that familiar, where is it? What is it like? What does it feel like in my body? And often that very investigation dissipates it a little bit. So the second stage is embracing. Embrace that feeling, that sensation, that contraction. Send any fearful, grasping, self-protective feelings your unconditional warmth. So whatever, instead you move toward it with your heart. So instead of rejecting the pain, instead of being oh, no, not this one, which creates more resistance, which, as Eckhart was telling us, creates more suffering, feeling bad about feeling bad, actually lean into it and send it love. Oh, I'm feeling this way. Okay, can I hold myself in this? And if we sit with ourselves feeling perhaps lonely today, just okay, this too shall pass. And by being with ourselves, all of a sudden, maybe that loneliness has already started to dissipate. So the third step after welcoming it is to stop. So stop or let go or interrupt the storyline, because often the story will be what is causing the suffering. So by becoming present just for a moment, it's like, yo, wait, stop. Take a breath, awareness back in the heart. And often, more often than not, everything's okay. If we're worrying about finances, often we're doing better than the highest percentage of the population on earth. If you have a bank account, even if you're in the minus, you have more than most people have. And this is something I've learned. My relationship with my boyfriend has really humbled me in that sense, because I grew up really with a sense of scarcity, feeling like there wasn't enough. Although I never lacked food. My mother was from a very humble background, and so she grew up needing, worrying about having food. So she transmitted that to me unintentionally. But so I then developed the sense of not having enough. And my boyfriend now, who's Guatemalan, doesn't have a bank account, doesn't have savings, and he's a tattoo artist. So sometimes he'll tattoo and he'll get, some money, and sometimes he won't tattoo. And when he's running out of money, then someone calls him and asks for a tattoo. And when I met him, I was like, so you don't have a bank account? Like, how is that for your mental health? Because I was thinking, even when I only have, let's say, like 500 pounds, I'm like, well, I only have 500 pounds. But the truth is that every time I've come close to not having any more, all of a sudden an opportunity arises, something comes through, and oh, interesting. I'm now, above the zero line again. I'm out of the red. So actually, this worrying is not helping me resolve my financial situation. It's actually just keeping me in a state of scarcity, in a state of worry. So it's interesting to see how someone who doesn't have a bank account isn't worried about money, but someone with a bank account is worried about money, which is, for me, it really brought me to reflect. So stop the storyline. Is it true that I don't have enough money? Do I have a roof? Do I have food? Do I have my legs and my arms? Well, then I'm pretty incredibly lucky. So back to what Christy was saying, living with an open heart is living with gratitude. Instead of look at what I don't have, because that is really the issue of the ego. The ego will always focus on what it doesn't have. And when you look at people who have a lot of money, like tons of money, and they'll have like 12 cars, but they still don't have enough cars because they need one that is, I don't know, that matches their shoes for Sundays. I don't know. And compassion for them as well, because the feeling of lack is real. The Buddha said our suffering is caused by our desires. And Nisargadatta Maharaj, who was also an enlightened person, who's actually from the 21st century, he said, desirelessness is a blissful state. So can we notice when we get caught in this state of desiring that causes us suffering, when we're experiencing suffering, unfortunately, more often than not, we cause suffering to others. So desire appears, I suffer, I'm frustrated, so then I'm causing suffering. And then I'm saying, how terrible is it that on the other side of the world, there's so much suffering? But meanwhile, I'm causing suffering to my colleagues or to my friends in my direct environment. So when I catch myself, pause. Okay, first, investigate. What is it? Oh, it's the sense of scarcity. Interesting. How does it feel? Where do I feel it? Oh yeah, there it is. And then stop the story. Is it true that I'm lacking? Is it true that no one loves me? Is it true that et cetera, because the ego loves to make fabulous stories about how unworthy we are, or how, I don't know, I'm sure your egos can make up great stories too. But when we speak to each other, we discover how much we have in common in our humanity, is that we all don't want to suffer. And we all want to experience joy and bliss. And we're scared that we won't experience joy and bliss. And we're scared that we will suffer. And the Buddha is saying, listen, suffering is part of existence as a human being, unless you awaken. So first of all, stop grasping onto the things that you do have, because they're all transient. Nothing will stay. So as the South African elder said, open your hands, let things come, let things go. Accept what is, as Eckhart tells us. Accept what is, feel it all. Let the emotions come, let the emotions go. And the more we practice this self-awareness throughout the day, the more there's a freedom, there's a spaciousness. And they did a study, was in one of the podcasts I listened to, which I found really interesting. They did a study on, so they were studying, I think, to be psychotherapists, but they were doing an analysis on the students. And so if I asked you all perhaps how your week was, you might say, oh, it was stressful, or it was a great week actually, but some might say, actually, I spent a lot of time worrying about this, or this is happening in the Middle East and this is causing me. So the answers will vary. And then they did something, is that on an hourly basis, while they were awake, they would check in and say, how are you feeling? And so they would be like, right now, I'm okay. I'm actually happy. I'm relaxed. Okay. And then they would check in again and they would say, yeah, I'm okay, actually. So if they broke it down on an hourly basis, they were a lot more okay than they thought they were. So if we're doing these regular check-ins throughout the day, at this very moment, if I ask you, how are you right now? Life's okay right now. I'm not suffering physically, or maybe, one of us is suffering physically, and that can be really challenging when there's chronic pain. But when we get to it, meditation is one of the tools that can help us recognize the inherent goodness in life, which is also one of the steps that we can take. But simply doing this check-in on a regular basis throughout the day. And when we do this check-in, we can do this thing of awareness back to the heart. So as I say this, bring your awareness back to your heart, back to the heart. And then my decision is likely to be very different. So I've shared with some of you, Rachel, the friend with whom I guide yoga teacher trainings, when she asked me to do yoga teacher trainings with her, I said no. And of course, my answer wasn't coming from my heart, it was coming from my mind. There was this whole story about how I couldn't teach teachers and how, they would realize that I wasn't really spiritual and like this whole thing. And Rachel, fortunately, messaged me again and was like, hey, please. And then I went in my heart. And, when she said, please, she's a friend, I was like, oh yeah, of course I'll do them with you. Yes, we'll do teacher trainings together. And it's the best decision I've ever made. And I'm so grateful I can do this. And some of you have participated in these wonderful, gatherings that are so transforming. But I was this close to miss the opportunity because I answered from my mind, not from my heart. And fortunately, Rachel's was like, just checking in, still no? And I was like, oh, no, wait, sorry, it's yes. So sometimes when someone asks us something, the answer is no, because the infinite reasons of things that could go wrong, or, the story. So can we go back to the heart? Can we notice this resistance, this contraction? If there's contraction, there's fear, there's close-heartedness. Oh, wait, I remember that workshop. I want to live with an open heart. Yes, heart is open, heart is open. And then something happens, heart is closed. And then coming back to this practice of, is there tension in the body? Is there tension in the mind? Is this story true? Can I interrupt the story? Pause, stop, stop for a second, mind. Oh, wait, none of it is true. I'm here. Everything's okay. And then moving from the heart, we can make a decision. And so the last step of this laser is remain. Stay present with the feeling. Keep going until it shifts or until it feels like too much of a struggle. This is not an endurance trial. Just remain with the feeling with kindness and warmth, leaning in as much as you can. So we live in a world that tells us, like with Uber Eats, I think, I see people here to cook. They go to the forest, the woods or the mountain, they chop wood, they bring the wood back home, And then you start your fire. And meanwhile, of course, you also had to get the food. And then you do the, here, me and my boyfriend don't have a fridge either. So making a meal, we do have a stove though, making a meal requires quite some effort. But at the end of it, you sit in front of your meal and wow, you give thanks naturally, right? It's not something that you force. It happens naturally because so much effort went into it. In the era of Uber Eats, I know some of you don't live anywhere near something like that. I'm thinking of you, Kelly, mostly on your island, no Uber Eats. But when I went to London, I was like, wow, it's so convenient. Ask and you shall receive. Anything you want, you can have it almost clicking your fingers. So it gets us used to feeling also that if we don't want to feel something, we should be able to just, like, I'm done with it. So what this method is telling us is first, when you're feeling, is investigate, okay, where is it? What is it? It's there. Okay, accept it. Stop the storyline. Be with it. Be with yourself. And when we do that, we're so much better equipped to deal with relationships. Because often what happens is that in our experience, the other is wrong, of course, and we will project completely. And if we haven't stopped and paused for a moment to see how much of the situation is our own doing, then we can walk away from a situation being like, they are so wrong. And, I really dislike them for being this way. And we have no awareness of the role we played. And this is really, I would say, one of our human tragedies, because we all want to love. We all want to be loved. We all want to get on. We all want to contribute to a peaceful world. And then somehow, with maybe the neighbor or maybe a colleague or someone or a friend, it just doesn't go that way. And somehow there is some form of conflict. Sometimes the conflict, of course, when you become more conscious, it's unlikely to come to violence, physical violence. But often there is still a lot of mental violence. There's still a lot of judgment. And I recognize it in myself, most of all in the silent retreats I participate in. And it's always difficult because I aspire to emit only love and kindness. And then in these silent retreats, I had this reflection, I shared it in my blog, but I was having this really peaceful meditation and I felt like I was really connected, and someone started coughing, like they were coughing really violently. And my first thought was like, oh, they're ruining my meditation, and then I was like, well, that's not a very compassionate thought, and I can laugh about it now. But at the moment, I was really disappointed because I thought, here I am, on my 4th silent retreat, sitting for hours and trying my best to embody only love. And someone is having a coughing fit. How uncomfortable for them. And my first thought, without a filter, is about my meditation. I am being bothered because they are coughing. And I share this, because I think that when we share about our shared humanity, it can give us a little bit of comfort that we're not so alone in our mental tendencies, because when we don't see it, we can't change them. So that's the issue, is that if we're not aware of them, then we're going around the world thinking, why is everyone like this? And I'm so great and they can't see it. But often we can all evolve spiritually a little bit. And this reminds me of a roommate I had. And she argued, so it happened, she argued often with many people, but on that day, she argued with the bouncer. We went to a club, and then she argued with the taxi driver, and then she argued with one of our housemates. And she looked at me and she was like, why does everyone just argue with me? And I was like, the common denominator is you. I didn't say it, but I was thinking, it's not that everyone is arguing with you, is that you are arguing with everyone. And there's a saying that says, be careful to argue with an idiot because it's hard to tell who the idiot is. And we might think, I'm relatively peaceful. Like you won't see me, honestly, you won't see me arguing with many people. And I can't think of the last time I had an argument. Having said that, last night we were watching a documentary about Ramana Maharshi, this Indian sage. And my boyfriend was saying, well, I don't think that sleep without dreams exists. But in yogic texts, they say clearly that there's only 3 states. Well, the 4th is when you're fully enlightened, but there's a sleep, awake, and a sleep with dreams, and a sleep without dreams. And I found myself defending this point as if my life depended on it. I was like, yes, but the scriptures say it, And then I was like, whoa, actually, that's completely an egoic behavior, because the ego feels threatened. If I relate to my thoughts, to my beliefs as who I am, him disagreeing with my belief feels like a threat to me. And so, still after all these silent retreats and all these conversations about living with an open heart and all the podcasts and all the books in my own home, I'm meeting my boyfriend with like, but I'm right and you're wrong. And then I saw it and I just reached out sheepishly, like just to touch his hand, because I realized, there was no yelling, there was no, no violence. But on a mental level, there definitely was resistance. I was like, but he's wrong. And the yogic scriptures are thousands of years old. And how could he challenge Ramana Maharshi, And ultimately, I can laugh about it now, but also it's a reflection of how our ego causes more violence in the world. So when we come back to the heart, please come back to your heart now. When we come back to the heart, there's no need to argue about who's right or who's wrong. He can believe that, and I believe something else, and everything is okay. It's okay if he's wrong. I'm kidding. but it's okay if we don't agree. And on a personal level, we can say, okay, like, he doesn't believe this, I don't believe this. On an international level, when the collective consciousness gets really attached to its ideas, then we can see how tragic the result is. So we might play it down and say, me holding on to being right is not a big deal. It may not turn into violence in this case, but actually this collective unconsciousness is the reason for the world state at this time. So actually, when we catch ourselves in this like defensive, resisting, wanting to argue, can we go back to the heart and recognize in ourselves this same quality? And, you might think, yeah, but there's a big gap between like going to war and just disagreeing with someone. It doesn't mean we can't disagree. But are we in a state of fighting? Are we contributing to a more peaceful world, or are we contributing to a less peaceful world? And that's a good question that we can ask ourselves. And when we notice that we're not contributing to a peaceful world, can we come back to the heart and choose differently? Choose, actually, this isn't worth it. I'm not going to fight over this, over being right. My life is not being threatened over being right. And actually, this inspires me to share this, this poem by Ibn Arabi. You can close your eyes and bring your awareness to your heart if you like. And he says, "My heart holds within it every form. It contains a pasture for gazelles, a monastery for Christian monks. There is a temple for idol worshippers, a holy shrine for pilgrims. There is the table of the Torah and the book of the Quran. I follow the religion of love and go whichever way his camel leads me. This is the true faith. This is the true religion." And so when we listen to these words, then we can realize that actually this religion of love, in this religion of love, there's actually a holy shrine for pilgrims and a monastery for Christian monks. There's space for everyone. And we don't need to argue over whether Muhammad or Jesus was the true prophet or Buddha, because it doesn't matter. Because as a matter of fact, they were all enlightened beings. So they were surely not fighting over who was right or who was wrong. And this leads me to speak about the spiritual heart. So are there any questions so far? I feel so inspired that I'm just flowing in a river of words, but are there any comments or questions? Anyone want to say anything? Yes, Luba.
I just wanted to ask if at some point we can have a 5-minute break for getting.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we were going to do it in 15 minutes, but we can take.
Oh, yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. We'll do that, and then we'll take. So in 15 minutes, we'll take a break, and we'll be about halfway. Great.
Thank you so much.
So the spiritual heart. The spiritual heart is known as Hridaya, and it is said to be in the center of the chest, a little to the right. So when I say bring your awareness to the heart, you might be feeling your physical heart, or you might be feeling the center of the chest, which is said to be the heart chakra, Anahata. And actually, the spiritual heart is different to the heart chakra. The heart chakra is still, let's say, Melissa's heart chakra. So it's mine, and there's still a sense of separation. The spiritual heart is said to be a doorway into the infinite, a doorway into the absolute. So interestingly, I'll share a little bit about Ramana's life story. This is Ramana. I've mentioned him a few times. I have him on my altar as inspiration because he was truly, I was going to say a unique being, but ultimately he stopped being him. So he was actually a very, very normal human being. However, he recognized his true essence, which we all have the potential of recognizing. As the Buddha said, you know, enlightenment is the recognition of the true self. He didn't say it in exactly those words, but that is his message. And so Ramana, he was not a spiritual person. He was not, you know, he was only 15 when he had his first awakening. And he was not studying spirituality. He would go to the temples with his family, but he was kind of like, okay, we're going to the temples because we're Hindu. And one day when he was at home, he had this feeling that he was going to die. He was about to die, that he was dying. And so I think most of us, if we felt we were dying, we'd probably run to our parents or to someone, you know, at that age and be like, I'm dying, help me. But actually, he very gracefully just lay down to die. He was like, okay, if I'm dying, then I guess I shall die. So he lay down to die. And in that moment, he perceived physical heart to stop, but he was also there. So in that moment, he questioned, but if that person on the ground is dead and there's still an I, who am I? That was his question. So that is the pointer that he recommended in meditation, to come to the realization of who we are, of what we are. And he said that the abode of the I was in the heart, but not the physical heart. And interestingly enough, I love when science and spirituality match. But interestingly enough, science reveals that on the right of the heart, so on the left, we have the big pumping heart. And on the right, there's like the equivalent of a pacemaker, we could call it. So this is where the initial impulse of life is. And in Tibetan Buddhism, they say that the seat of the soul is in the heart. And in Christian philosophy as well, Mother Teresa spoke a lot about the heart. And in Sufism, they also speak a lot about the heart. So when we're speaking of the heart, we're not so much speaking about this beautiful organ that keeps the blood pumping around the body, although it's great and we're grateful for it. We're actually speaking of this part of us that is our soul. In Sanskrit, we use the word Atman, and it is said that Atman and Brahman are the same. So Brahman is another word for Allah, or
some people might resonate with the word God, the word universe, the word life, great spirit, great mystery, all these words for something that is ultimately ineffable. We cannot name it. If we try to name it, then we misunderstand it. But we use names because our brain likes names. So we're like, but wait, I don't understand. And we're not supposed to understand it. However, we can connect with that. And so every time right now, you can bring your awareness back to your heart. Every time we bring our awareness back to our heart, we're connecting with that part of us. The part of us that knows that we're not separate, but one. The part of us that recognizes the other as us. And this is really the message, in many tribes, there is some sort of recognition, namaste. Namaste, the translation is the light in me sees and recognizes the light in you. And we will say this to anyone, it's not namaste minus to that guy who I don't agree with. It's not like namaste to some of you it's actually to one and all. And when we can recognize that everyone is just as we are, that everything is born of the same essence, then we live life so differently. Then if we walk past someone in the street who is begging and is asking for food, if we have a sandwich, we will give half that sandwich because we recognize them as ourselves. I said half the sandwich in case you don't have another half and you're really hungry. You can give half, but you could give your whole sandwich. And, I was in Paris not so long ago, and a friend of mine said to me, you can't give to everyone. And I thought, why can't we give to everyone? Ultimately, if we do recognize, and I'm not saying that I have an answer to this. I know you have bills to pay, and I understand that there is a cost to living. But imagine if we all lived with this knowing, not just this belief, but this knowing that everyone we come across is just like us. It could be me. There's a practice in Buddhism that is imagining a person as your mother or your father or your grandfather. So if you saw a beggar in the street, imagine if it was your grandfather. Because we don't know people's life situations. We don't know what has happened in their lives for that to happen. And we might think, oh, but then what if I overgive? But often when we give, we receive. And we might look at an example like Mother Teresa, someone who was at the feet of people with leprosy, someone who worked until her very last breath. And we think, where was she giving from? She certainly wasn't giving from her personal individual self. She was giving from that boundless source of infinite energy. And this is not something, unique to Jesus, because we know that Jesus did these marvelous deeds of healing, and we hear of these stories and we think like, wow, these amazing beings, but we are not so different to them. We are simply a little bit cut off from our spiritual heart. And a very simple way to connect with the spiritual heart is with awareness. So every time in this practice, when we've been going back to the heart, we're strengthening that connection. So the spiritual heart stops being this like concept of like, yeah, it's great to be good, but I'm still annoyed that my brother did this, But actually, yeah, it's great to be good and I'm annoyed that wait. And it's so different to live from the heart, to live in the heart. And when we're living with awareness in the heart, naturally the heart opens. The contraction that is there begins to soften. And if we don't feel capable of giving, then sometimes giving a little bit can be helpful. So giving until we feel, on the edge of our comfort zone, it might be, it might not be very much what we're giving. It might be a smile. It might be just hello. This is something a homeless person told me once, and I feel somewhat connected to the homeless specifically because one of my uncles was homeless and he wasn't able to receive help from the family. So he chose his homelessness, but it was very difficult nonetheless. And I met a homeless man in London, and he said to me, you know what the hardest part is about being homeless? Is that people ignore you. So he wasn't saying, you know, going hungry. He didn't say, you know, about being in the cold. He said, it's people ignoring you, pretending that you don't exist. And so we might feel like, oh, I don't have anything to give. You know, I don't have any money. I don't have any cash, or I don't have any food, or maybe I don't have anything to give at this moment. But we all have our presence. We all have our smile. We can all say, hello, good afternoon. Even if you don't give anything more, but simply giving that can be really powerful for someone who feels like they're completely invisible to the world. So connecting to the spiritual heart gives us access to this infinite compassion, to this infinite fire for being of service. Because sometimes what we confuse, and I must admit that I kind of thought that's what I meant initially when I was like, oh, so if I accept that everything is good in the world, then I don't need to do anything anymore for anyone, you know, be of service. And there's a story that says that there was a man traveling through the desert with his disciple. And he said, you know, make sure that you tie the camel. And they had one camel. And then in the morning, the teacher comes and he says, where's the camel? And the young man, the disciple, says, oh, I asked Allah to take care of the camel, and you said, you know, we can trust God. And he said, yes, but Allah only has your hands to tie the camel. So yes, ask God for support, but take the action. Don't just say, you know, I pray that this will happen and do nothing about it. No, take the action, take inspired action, not coming from reactivity, and then pray. Sure, pray is very powerful practice, but remember that you have the hands to take the action. So we cannot resolve all the problems of the world. Of course, we cannot, but often we can do more than we are currently doing. And I'm thinking of a simple example, you know, collecting trash on the beach, collecting trash when we go to the mountain. Often, you know, here in Guatemala, the recycling system is pretty much non-existent. So that's something that I really struggled with. And I said to my boyfriend often, I would be like, oh, just seeing so much trash just breaks my heart. And I would always say that. And one day he was like, well, we should just pick it up then, you know, and there's so much of it that actually, yeah, it's, you know, it's not diminishing by tons, but at least when I pick it up, I don't just go around saying, it breaks my heart how much trash there is. Sure, okay, it breaks my heart, then let that heart brokenness like this weight, and every time I'm walking thinking, oh, there's so much trash. And that also inspires me to produce less trash. So if I have a choice between something that I can buy, you know, in a bag, where a reusable bag, or one in plastic, then so I am making changes, but I'm not just going around saying, you know, climate crisis is just terrible, and it's just, and talking about it, which is, as you may remember at the beginning of the session, we were talking of this habit of reliving emotions, of repeating patterns, by repeating the story, going over the story of how terrible it is that this is happening, meanwhile doing nothing. So going back to the heart, and from this heart, there's often a lot of clarity. What can I do? Sometimes there's nothing we can do, but often there is something we can do. Going back to the heart, what can I do? And then seeing with clear eyes, not with resentment, not with frustration, but really with clarity, what can I do? And perhaps all I can do is pray. And that's enough. Or perhaps I can offer some support in some kind of way. So we'll take a 10-minute break. So take your time to do what you need to do. But I'd like to invite you to keep your awareness in your heart for those 10 minutes. So if you're going to drink a tea, while you make your tea, see if you can keep your awareness in your heart. If you're going to the toilet while you pee or do whatever, keep your awareness in your heart. Whatever you're doing, see if you can keep your awareness in your heart. I will be doing the same for 10 minutes, and we'll meet again. Well, we're all on different time zones, but in 10 minutes. Okay, see you in 10.
Melissa,
Yes.
hi, can I ask you, is it keep our awareness on the human heart or the spiritual heart?
The spiritual heart.
Okay.
Yes, good question.